Welcome everybody to today's talk. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. On behalf of the library, I'm delighted to welcome you to this lunchtime talk with Dr. Helen Roche on her new book, The Third Reich's Elite Schools, A History of the Napoles. And as I understand, this is her second talk for us. And it's great to have her back, even if only virtually. Drawing on material from 80 archives in 6 different countries worldwide, as well as eyewitness testimonies from over 100 former pupils, Helen Roche presents the first comprehensive history of the Third Reich's most prominent elite schools, the National Political Education Institutes, or Napoles, or NPEA for short in German. The Napoles provided an all-encompassing National Socialist total education, featuring ideological indoctrination, pre-military training, and a packed program of extracurricular activities, including school trips and exchanges throughout Europe and beyond, including to Britain, which I think Helen will speak a bit about today. We are going to hear from Dr. Roche about this enterprise, which can be termed the Nazi dictatorship's most effective and experimental effective educational experiment. So before I introduce Dr. Roche, just a few notes of housekeeping in case you haven't attended our events before. We will keep everybody on mute throughout the entire talk so that there aren't any interruptions. So please address any comments or questions that you might have in the chat. You can do this at any time, but we will save some time at the end to try to take up as many as possible. We have also enabled auto transcription. And just to note that this is automated, and so sometimes it doesn't always accurately reflect the speaker's words. If you have any technical difficulty, you can send me a direct message or my colleague Olivia, and we can try to help. And finally, I just want to let you know that this session is being recorded, but your camera won't be appearing in the recording. So now to our speaker. Dr. Helen Roche is Associate Professor in Modern European Cultural History at the University of Durham. Her second book, The Third Reich's Elite Schools, was recently published by Oxford University Press. Her work has been featured in the press nationally and internationally, including appearances in The Times, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, on the BBC and Sky News. Her first book, Sparta's German Children, The Ideal of Ancient Sparta in the Royal Prussian Cadet Corps, 1818 to 1920, and in National Socialist Elite Schools, the Napoles, 1933 to 1945, was published in 2013. So welcome back, Helen, and the floor is now yours.
Wonderful. Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you so much for the kind invitation and to everyone for turning up online. I know we've had an awful lot of online events recently, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to be here in person, but it's wonderful to see so many people here. And yeah, as Christine mentioned, there's quite a nice symmetry to this because I gave a work in progress paper at the Wiener Library as part of the lunchtime lecture series back in 2013, where I focused more on the Napoles entanglement with the Holocaust and the way that former pupils framed their recollections of this. So it's really amazing to be able to, as it were, return, even if virtually, to talk about the book now that the project has finally been completed. I'm aware that the audience here today is, a bit mixed, so I won't necessarily go into an enormous amount of highly academic detail. You might want to bring that up in the discussion, but I'll start off by saying a bit about what the Napoles were, how they functioned, and also say a bit about how the book and the project came into being. And then I thought I'd finish off by talking a bit about an aspect of this research which gained quite a lot of attention in the media since the book was released. Again, Christine mentioned this, but these exchange programs which took place between the Napoles and both British public schools and US academies during the 1930s. So this is a facet of the school's history which hadn't really been explored previously, but it's obviously something that touches more nearly on the relationship between the Anglophone world and Nazi Germany. And this is something which I think the Wiener Library has also long been interested in illuminating and elucidating. So I'm not going to speak for too long, probably something between 20 and 30 minutes, definitely no longer than half an hour, because I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And I imagine, based on other talks, that there'll be quite a lively discussion. And before I get started, I had one further point of housekeeping, which is that at the moment, this book, I should have brought it with me, but I forgot, so I can't actually show it to you, but I'll share the screen and show you the cover in a moment. At the moment, it's only available in hardback, and it's really prohibitively expensive. It costs £90. And if after the talk is over, you think it's something you might be interested in reading but could only manage to obtain if it was in a cheaper paperback edition, then let us know in the chat or send me an email, because basically Oxford University Press have said, if you can provide enough written proof, if you can provide a dossier saying that people are interested and they want a paperback, then we might consider publishing it more cheaply. But yeah, obviously, if not, that's totally fine, but I just mention it here. So I'll just share the screen now, hopefully this will function. Can everybody see that all right? Great. Yeah, so some of you may be wondering, what were the Napolas? And this is actually a question that even contemporaries during the Third Reich would have also had, because these elite schools were actually notoriously secretive when it came to publicizing their aims and practice, particularly in the opening years of the Third Reich. And this led on one occasion for a leading regional newspaper in Western Germany, which was writing an article on Napola pupils' contributions to the charitable Nazi winter welfare campaign, to write this headline saying, Italian youth raise money for the winter help, because the editors had assumed that they must be, from Naples. They didn't know what the Napolas were. But as Christine briefly mentioned, the official name for these schools was National Political Education Institutes, or Nationalpolitische Erziehungsanstalten. The official abbreviation was NPEA, but Napola was obviously a much more convenient way of abbreviating it. So that was what they were called in popular parlance, and also by pupils and teachers. So these were really the Third Reich's most prominent institutions for training future elites at a secondary level. And by the end of World War II, there were over 40 schools in existence, and this includes in countries which we now know as Czechia, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and more were actually planned for Norway and even neutral Switzerland. This was the plan to kind of extend their reach literally all over the continent as the Nazi Empire extended its grasp further and further. So these were boarding schools. They were mainly for boys aged between 10 and 19. There were 4 schools for girls as well, which you can see as white triangles or circles on the map there. And they really aimed to train leaders in all walks of life, so not just the Nazi Party or the military. However, alongside academic and sporting education, pre-military training did play a very important role, and many former pupils ended up serving as officers and dying in World War II. One of the particularly interesting things about schools is that they were also trying to foster what we might call the socialist aspect of National Socialism. So they would give free or very heavily subsidized places to workers and farmers' sons. In practice, the majority of pupils remained from middle-class bourgeois backgrounds, but the authorities went on this massive recruitment drive to try and drum up support and applications from working and farming families. And there was this kind of propaganda trope that here the son of a general might sleep in a dormitory or sit at a desk with, as the son of a the son of a tram driver. And I've just put one example of this kind of propaganda on the slide here. We've got two boys pictured in this article from Front Worker magazine. And one's allegedly the son of a manual labourer, one's allegedly the son of a miner, and the legend below the miner's son reads, his father is a miner, but he has what it takes to do a university degree. That's why he is successfully completing the Napolas training. His parents don't have to worry about the material side of things. In general, school fees have to be paid, but these are set aside if the financial circumstances of the parents don't allow for it. The social, economic, and professional status of the parents play no role whatsoever. The boy's character, ability, and achievement are decisive. So this is the kind of idea that they're pushing, this idea of equality, which fits into kind of Volksgemeinschaft ideology and the Third Reich more generally. In addition, the schools implemented what they called missions or Einsätze, mostly in the school holidays. So older pupils had to work either on farms, in factories, or down mines for several weeks. Health and safety nowadays would have a fit. They would live with the labouring or farming families, and the idea was that they would be learning about the hardships which they had to live with on a daily basis, so that they would be better able to lead them later on. And again, we have a couple of sort of propagandistic photos from press coverage of these initiatives on the slide. So hard work isn't child's play from Das Schwarze Korps SS magazine. And you can see pictures of them sort of working in different mining activities, and then also a picture of a pupil with the family as well. So the first three Napolas were founded as early as April 1933. They were actually a birthday present for Hitler by the education minister Bernhard Rust. And all in all, they were modelled on a sort of amalgam of the Prussian Cadet Corps, the British public school system, and the harsh educational practices of ancient Sparta. But they also took influences from movements that we might find more surprising. So reform pedagogy was something that played a key role, and also the early 20th century German youth movements. Prospective pupils generally had to undergo this incredibly rigorous and grueling selection process. And this was supposed to test not only their alleged racial purity according to Nazi ideological criteria and their academic abilities, but also placed extreme emphasis on physical prowess and sheer courage. And I've just put, again, a sort of propagandistic portrayal of some of the activities that they might have to undergo in the selection test. You can see sort of assault courses, boxing to see whether they were tough. And then they had what were called, Mutproben, or tests of courage. And I'll just go into this a bit more. So one of the eyewitnesses whom I corresponded with, who went to Napolas Rügen on the island of Pupils, Pupus on the island of Rügen, Hans P., he described one of the common ordeals. Non-swimmers had to jump from our diving platform 80 meters out in the Baltic Sea, reached by a jetty from a 3-meter board into deep water. We older ones brought them out again. No one should hesitate. The swimmers had to jump out of a 3rd-story window into a blanket. Anyone who hesitated could go right home again. And you might almost think that this seems a bit over-exaggerated. Could this really have been happening to 9 or 10-year-old children? But again, we have actual photographs of this kind of thing happening from the press coverage. So this one on the right hand side is from Napola Oranienstein, which was a palace which had formerly belonged to the Dutch royal family near Koblenz. And they had these balconies, which you can see, and you had to jump from this balcony without hesitating, just hoping that they would be holding a blanket to catch you. And again, we also have one of these tests of diving from a board, probably if you couldn't swim, into a swimming pool. Then if you actually managed successfully to pass all the aspects of this selection examination, you would join your Napolas first Zug. This was the word for class, but it actually means platoon, and you'd learn to live in this highly militarized and enclosed boarding school community. The schools provided a pretty extensive variety of activities for pupils. Academic lessons were taken seriously, but they really still took a back seat when compared with physical education. And this wasn't just sort of the kind of thing you'd normally do in PE, perhaps at school in this country, but it included the opportunity to learn to ride, glide, sail, drive or ski, as well as a lot of engagement with pre-military training like small bore shooting and cross-country war games. And again, this slide shows some examples of that. Needless to say, the schools were also hothouses for the propagation of Nazi ideology, and countless former pupils died on the battlefields of World War II, so did many teachers as well. As the Third Reich began to disintegrate, lessons were subject to ever greater disruption, and conditions at the schools generally worsened. However, one of the most innovative aspects of the schools programme during the interwar years, and one which many pupils found very attractive, was the amount of travel abroad. And this could include trips to Greece or Italy, kind of educational, but also in a sense propagandistic, you know, making connections with fascist Italian youth groups and so forth. Or a lot of it was to do with kind of borderland ideology and persuading so-called ethnic Germans to want to return to the Reich in borderland areas in Eastern Europe. So the example that I put on the slide is just from one school, Napola Köslin, and in the summer of 1938, they went to all of these different countries, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, with these kinds of propagandistic aims in mind. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but there was also a very fully fledged system of exchange programs with schools in countries that were supposedly suitably Nordic, you know, in again these ideological racial terms, and that included Britain and the US, as we'll see, but also Sweden and Norway to a certain extent. And we even have evidence for a couple of Turkish exchange students at one of the Napolas, or two of them, although they appear to have had more problems settling in. So yeah, I'll go back to the exchange programs in more detail in a minute. But before I do so, I wanted to also say a little bit about the genesis of the project, you know, how I came to research this topic and the aims of the book. So it might come as a surprise to some people in the audience, but I started my academic career not as a historian, a modern historian at all, but as a classicist. And all of my degrees were also in classics. And my first book, well, my PhD project, was where my interest in the Napolas began. I started looking at them in 2008-9 in the context of this PhD project, where I was looking at the influence of ancient Sparta on German military education during the 19th and 20th centuries. And during the course of the PhD, I managed to get in touch with around 60 former pupils And already at that point, I was quite surprised by the fact that there didn't seem to be a single monograph on these schools, not in German, but not in English either. And the current, as it were, standard works on the schools, which were both themselves written by Nazi elite school pupils, so had problems of their own, were published in the late 1960s or early 1970s. Otherwise, there only really seemed to be a few pieces of published autobiographical or memoir literature by former pupils. They began to be published for the most part, often self-published as well, during the 1990s and 2000s. And I've just put a couple of the most popular examples on the slide. So then it seemed to me, well, this could be a really interesting thing to do, to write a history of the schools as a second book project, because I already knew where to start in terms of, historiographical foundations and also archival research. And I also thought that it made sense to try and elicit as many eyewitness testimonies from former pupils as possible before time ran out, because even at that time, most were in their 80s or even 90s and were becoming frailer with every year that passed. And on average, the people I spoke to or corresponded with were in their early to mid-teens in 1945. I think it would have been a lot more difficult if they'd been, say, people who'd been on the Eastern Front and so forth, but they were a bit younger than that. And it's also worth noting in this connection, I guess, that over the past few years, quite a few of them have died due to COVID, or many are just very, very ill, very frail and can't be contacted anymore. So this was, if you like, a once in a lifetime opportunity, I guess. So fast forward to over a decade later, and I've managed to collate material from all of these different archives, about 80 archives in Germany and Austria and elsewhere. I think this is just the ones in Germany and Austria that are on that slide. And I'd also corresponded with or interviewed around 115 former pupils, and also some of them had let me see material from their personal collections, which, no historian had ever had an opportunity to look at before. So I was finally able to, synthesize all of this massive amount of material and put together a manuscript that I thought, could generally stand the test of time as, in a sense, the first comprehensive history of the schools. But this isn't to say that there aren't, a myriad aspects of the school's history which will reward further research. This is an incredibly rich field and we're only beginning to scratch the surface. So I hope many people will discover this and kind of build on it in the years to come. So as the project advanced, my aims for it became more and more ambitious. I started off basically wanting to ensure that people didn't lump all of the schools together, either with each other or with other types of Nazi elite school, which tended to happen quite a lot in existing literature or just popular culture, popular knowledge. So I was always keen to emphasize what I called the variety within unity, the way in which individual schools' past tradition shape their ethos, and that might be the very militaristic ethos at the Prussian cadets, former Prussian cadet schools, maybe more humanistic traditions at schools like Schulpforta, or, schools in Austria, which took over existing state institutions. And that is still reflected in the second part of the book, which you can see on the table of contents. I also wanted at this point to kind of dispel myths that the schools were totally chaotic, that their program was completely ineffective, some of which seem to stem from like exculpatory narratives by former pupils, including the two historians who'd written on them, because in a sense it seemed that the schools actually were quite effective, albeit obviously in the service of an evil regime than scholars had been wholly willing to acknowledge. But then as I began to transition more fully into modern history from this more classical reception background, and started steeping myself in scholarship on Nazi Germany specifically, I really began to see ever more clearly how kind of imbricated and implicated the Napolas were in all of the regime's webs of power, and how their, incredibly racist ethos and extremely racialized selection process fitted into current conceptions of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, the kind of national or racial community which Nazism was trying to create. And in effect, how so much of what the schools were doing and how they worked formed a kind of microcosm or petri dish, if you like, in which we could see broader tendencies in the history of the Third Reich magnified or reflected. So I guess a couple of examples of that would be things like the school's radically unequal yet complementary approach to gender politics when we look at the differences between the boys' schools and the girls' schools, their involvement in broader Germanization policies as the Nazi Empire extended across Eastern and Western Europe. And as we saw from the map, schools were founded throughout the so-called Greater German Reich during wartime. Or, the way that the schools were entangled in this polycratic wrangling, this factional strife between competing factions, the Nazi Party, the SA, the SS, the Wehrmacht, and other branches of the Nazi state. And then finally, as I drew the project to a close, I realized that I also wanted to use these insights to demonstrate that the history of education and the history of childhood and youth, which are sometimes seen as a bit subsidiary by some scholars, not kind of quite real history in the same way, are actually completely crucial to understanding the political, cultural, and social history of any regime or society, and show that we can gain new insights by exploring these different voices and institutions within a broader historical context. And in that connection, I would say, what could be more indicative of a state's aims and ethos than the ways in which it seeks to indoctrinate its youth, or the particular virtues which it's seeking to instill in its citizens of the future. So all in all, I'd suggest that the book as a whole can demonstrate the value of fusing histories of childhood, youth, and education with political and social histories of everyday life. And then above all, it tells the stories of pupils at the schools and examines what life there was like and the impact that had on pupils in later life. And these were stories that hadn't previously been told, or not fully anyway. So I'm happy to go into any of this in more detail in the discussion, but for now, let's focus in on this aspect of the exchange programs with public schools here in the UK, and I'll say a tiny bit about the American exchanges too. So to start off, here's an image which I think is particularly significant and iconic. I mean, perhaps not just when we're talking about the Napoles, but when we're talking about the relationship between Britain and Nazi Germany in the interwar period more generally. And, perhaps shows a time when this is before a football match that took place at the Napola in Ballenstedt in the Südharz region of Germany in April 1937. And the idea of a time when the swastika and the Union Jack can fly side by side, nowadays it feels like the cover of a counterfactual history or something like that. But at this point, people didn't have hindsight, and, a lot of people were kind of willing to perhaps give the Third Reich a bit of the benefit of the doubt, and sort of how can we, understand that is quite interesting. And obviously this image was something which, when it was shared in the press release for the book in November, drew quite a lot of interest from journalists with a range of different takes, as you can see from The Guardian to The Telegraph headline, which I thought was an interesting, rather odd take on it. But what I wanted to do was to go into more detail by looking at the story of a boy who attended one exchange in more detail. And this is Dick Hargreaves, who I actually managed to meet in 2014 when he was in his 90s. He doesn't look it, as you can see from the side. He looks very hale and hearty, although he did unfortunately die last year, I think. So I'll stop sharing the screen for now. But yeah, so in spring 1936, a teenage schoolboy and later decorated war hero, Dick Hargreaves, was given this chance to go on an all expenses paid exchange trip to Germany. But this wasn't an ordinary exchange. Hargreaves' destination was Napola or Hohenstein, which we've already seen in some of the pictures near Koblenz. And by taking part in the exchange, Hargreaves and his 10 companions from Dauncey's school in Wiltshire were to be exposed to the Napoles total programme of education, indoctrination, and National Socialist propaganda. What's really interesting is that we have a diary that Hargreaves wrote during the exchange. So this is a remarkable document because, again, it's portraying what's going on without any hint of hindsight. So, for instance, his initial impressions recorded in the diary are overwhelmingly favourable. He calls the school a damn good place, a huge castle done up modern and very posh, armchairs, super labs, stables, school bicycles, and heaven knows what. Then again, according to the diary, he says everyone is extraordinarily decent. He admires the boys' Nazi uniforms as very smart. But what's really fascinating is that he was a witness to the May Day celebrations that took place in the neighbouring town of Dietz an der Lahn. And on April 30th of 1936, his diary records a trip with our Kameraden, so the Napola boys, to watch the maypole being hoisted and folk dances by the Hitler Youth. So he describes how they listened to speeches by some of the big bugs of the town and took part in community singing. So here's a quote from the diary. He says, "There was a good bit of hiling, which we also did because we were in a huge crowd. It was a magnificent scene, the old castle towering above the marketplace, in which were thousands of enthusiastic peasants lit by torch and candlelight." End quote. Then the following day, Friday, May the 1st, was the Spring Festival or Frühlingsfest. And in the diary, he records that he and the other boys had to get up at 6 o'clock to salute the flag and parade. And then they were marched to Dietz to assemble with the local Hitler Youth to listen to a 90-minute speech by Hitler being broadcast on the radio, kind of in the open air in the square. Then the afternoon, they had to come back and hear another broadcast speech by Hitler. And Hargreaves notes, again, this is a quote, "He worked himself into such a frenzy and was able to move the crowd so tremendously that we saw 3 people faint, not from fatigue or crush, but just by his amazing oratory powers. Then after Hitler had been hurled off the earth, Goering spoke for half an hour." So I think what this passage captures really interestingly is how easily foreign observers could still be swept up by the fervour of Heiling and Hitlerism. That's made quite poignantly clear, although the interminable speeches by Hitler and his henchmen seem to have paled soon enough. So this is just one small example, but again, my research into the Napoles during the 1930s, I've found that, probably hundreds of pupils took part in this programme of exchanges or sporting tournaments. And if we take Hohenstein as an example, between 1935 and 38, they took part in exchanges with Westminster, St Paul's, Tunbridge School, Dauncey's and Bingley School in Yorkshire. Hohenstein also entertained headmasters and exchange teachers from Shrewsbury School, Dauncey's, Bolton School, and also involved in sports tournaments with Eton, Harrow, Westminster, Winchester, Shrewsbury, Bradfield and Bryanston. Then I guess I should also mention the US program too. So there were exchange programs with several American academies. This took place under the aegis of the International Schoolboy Fellowship, and the American schools involved included Tabor Academy in Massachusetts, St Andrews, Delaware, and Phillips Academy, Andover, and Phillips Academy, Exeter, which were all considered, you know, top drawer educational establishments. And in a sense, what the Third Reich was aiming, what the Napoleon authorities wanted to do with the exchanges, was have the German boys and staff acting as kind of cultural ambassadors for the Third Reich, getting them to elicit sympathy for Hitler's policies and ultimately spreading pro-Nazi propaganda. And many British headmasters at the time were actually persuaded of the wisdom of hosting the exchanges. One particular example that I found was E.K. Milliken, who was the head of Lancing House Prep School in Lowestoft. And he was so enthused by his experiences of exchange with the Napola in Naumburg that he wrote an article for the Association of Prep Schools journal or newsletter, expressing his conviction that the exchanges would, quote, further that spirit of true comradeship of which the world so sorely stands in need. And he encouraged all the schools who were members of the Association of Prep Schools to welcome the Napolas with open arms. Even those who were less easily convinced, like the headmaster of Kingswood School in Bath, A.B. Sackett, hoped that the programme could provide, quote, a chance to influence the sons of senior Nazis by discussion and friendship. In America, we find quite a similar pattern. So the headmaster of Tabor Academy, Walter Huston Lillard, was still trying to persuade American schools to continue with the programme, even after the sort of Reich pogrom night or Kristallnacht in November 1938. And basically, if we look at all of these reactions from the British and the US side in tandem, really people appear to have been willing to give the Napolas the benefit of the doubt, and they've taken this facade of disinterested friendship at face value. So maybe we can see this as mirroring broader cultural attitudes in England at the time. The British participants or US participants may not have been convinced by the Third Reich's aims and ideals, but they continued to hope that their national differences could be cast aside in the name of international cooperation, at least until Nazi belligerence reached its fatal climax. So this has just been, I guess, a very brief whistle-stop tour of a few of the facets of the project, but I'm hoping that you'll have many questions which can take us deeper. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. That was really fantastic. And it was, as you said, a terrific whistle-stop tour, but you raised so many issues about which I hope there will be a lot of questions. And it obviously has many connections, as you pointed out, to history of childhood and kind of cultural perceptions and internationalism. And it was a fascinating talk. There are already a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to get right to them. A couple, I'll just join two together because you mentioned in your talk the sort of the connections between the schools and as reflective of wider Nazi ideals, but also connected to other institutions. And so there's a question from Vicky about whether students were part of the Hitler Youth, and I guess the sort of overall connection to the Hitler Youth. And then a kind of a question about the sort of alumni status of the students, if they went on to, I can't actually find that now. Oh, did former pupils become significant figures in the SS or in the Wehrmacht?
Yeah, thank you. Those are two great questions. So in terms of the connection with the Hitler Youth, what's quite interesting is that apart from some of the Napolas which were founded on the federal states initiative that weren't actually founded in the first instance by the Prussian or Reich Education Ministry, the Hitler Youth connection was not as marked as you might expect. There was actually a bit of a kind of competition between Rust and the Reich Youth leader Bauder von Schirach. So they might, I think it was only when or just before the Hitler Youth law was brought in, that then it was imposed that they would have their own autonomous Hitler Youth groups, and they would also be leading local sort of civilian, as it were, Hitler Youth groups in their neighborhood. So also Baldur von Schirach and Robert Lai, who was the Reich organization leader, founded these competing elite schools, which some people might have heard of, called the Adolf Hitler schools. And the idea was that they had an explicitly Hitler Youth ethos and were explicitly training people to be party leaders. So yeah, and then the status of alumni. I mean, we don't, I guess, have anyone reaching incredibly high positions in those organizations, just because, you know, the first people who graduated would only have been graduating, you know, in the late 30s and so forth. So they didn't have that much time. But what is interesting is that when it came to wartime, all of the armed forces were desperately competing to get Napoles pupils or alumni enrolling in their branch. So the Waffen-SS were really keen, like Himmler was trying to get his claws over the whole system and kind of beat Rust away, but never quite managed it. But you would have the, you know, admirals in the Navy and people in the Oberkommando of the Wehrmacht saying, you know, we've never had a Napola pupil that we don't want to, you know, have as an officer. Like, they're all just amazing quality of sort of material compared with the normal civilian schools and what the Hitler Youth are providing us with. So from that perspective, all of the pre-military training and everything does seem to have had an effect.
Thanks, Helen. And we had a question about sources, and you sort of tantalizingly talked about how you got to know some of the former students in your previous project and have known them for a while. And so Joe was asking, would you say something about how you went about finding former pupils, and have any of them subsequently read your book and had any interesting comments? Yeah, I actually had the same question, so I'm glad somebody brought it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, when I was starting the PhD, I basically started off by looking at the material that had been published and trying to look up the names of people who'd written on a website called telefonbuch.de, like online telephone directory. And in quite a few cases where the names were not that common, you could actually find an address. And I just sort of wrote an introductory letter. And I also wrote to a few historians, and they sometimes also knew eyewitnesses and passed details on. But once I had, you know, even just a few contacts from people, they would then pass them on to other people. There are still these old boys networks of very sort of self-styled Napolaner. And so if you knew somebody who was in one of those, they might just pass either pass on addresses or sort of say, oh, you know, this person is researching this. Do you want to get in touch with her? So it snowballed surprisingly quickly. Again, it's not something that would probably be possible now, sadly. And yeah, sorry, there was another bit to the question. Oh, have they read the book? Yeah. So with Sparta's German Children, I was able to order about maybe 60 to 100 extra copies of the book at cost price from the publisher in order to send them to the eyewitnesses. And so most of, I mean, not all of them have great English, but quite a lot of them were able to read it and sent me comments and so forth. Again, unfortunately, because the book is so expensive, you know, only a few of them have been able to get it. And obviously I haven't been able to, you know, I can't even really afford to buy more copies for myself than the few that I got for myself and family. But I am hoping that, you know, that the ones who have read it will let me know their thoughts. You know, it only came out very recently and it's not available. I think it's only just come out in the US, for instance. So I will, you know, have more information on their thoughts probably in a few months, hopefully.
I accidentally skipped over a question a question about a sort of reference to the issue of kind of continuities, and this one is about particularly the takeover of buildings of original Habsburg elite schools. And there was a question based on your map about the Wien Theresianum, if you could comment on the extent to which the Napoles took over elite, sort of already existing structures. And
yes, so yeah, unlike the Adolf Hitler schools, which were making much of the fact that they would have all new buildings and then hardly any of them were actually built, the Napoles would generally take over existing buildings and institutions. And in the case of the former Prussian cadet schools and also the Austrian Bundeserziehungsanstalten, which were kind of similar state boarding schools during that period, they kind of took them and then wanted, in a sense, to maybe go back to the cadet school ethos that had reigned before the post-World War I treaties, when obviously military institutions were closed down. And in terms of the Theresianum, also places like Schulpforta and the former monastic school in Ilfeld, they would kind of take places, particularly that had a certain cachet. Obviously in Austria, it was easier because, you know, of the Anschluss with Schulpforta, they had to wait until they could accuse the school of like having, you know, problems with pederasty and stuff, and then they used that as an excuse to take it into their own hands. And also, I mean, one thing that it's really interesting in this connection is that they would very often expropriate Catholic, particularly Catholic schools and convents, monasteries, institutions, particularly in Austria where the Concordat didn't apply. And they would use that as a way of, you know, using SS and Gestapo kind of having driven these orders, these schools out, to just take over those campuses and have ready-made kind of school buildings. And that happened not just in Austria and Germany, but also in the Netherlands and I think Poland. In Poland and the Czech Republic, they also took over things that had been owned by the existing aristocracy, so stately homes, places like the castle in Ploskowice, which became Napola, Sudetenland in Ploskowitz, and so forth.
Thank you. And we have another question about the kind of post-war biographies of the students. And so Andrew's asking if any of the alumni played significant parts in civilian society in post-1945 GDR, FDR, for example, as politicians, judiciary, military, civil service, and if so, were they open about their education, and did it prove an asset or a detriment to career progress? So there's a few questions there. It's a really good one, really good set of questions, because obviously, yeah, the time frame would be interesting to see about their biographies after the war.
Yes. So even with the people who I was in touch with, there was a former Austrian justice minister, Erich Honecker's former right-hand man in the East German Youth Organization, and a former NATO commander-in-chief for Central Europe, as well as you know, a couple of Bundeswehr generals. And I mean, that's not to say that they all went into incredibly high positions. And in some cases, the post-war denazification meant that they weren't allowed to proceed to higher education if it was known that they'd been at Napoles. So you might get some of them doing more vocational careers than you might expect because of that. In the GDR, I think it was particularly important to keep that hidden. But there's an irony, because even with the National People's Army in East Germany, they would actually try and recruit, I believe, Napola pupils to high military positions, because even despite the ideological clash, if you like, they knew that that training had been so good that they would be effective, you know, sort of good on its own terms, I guess, at training military men. And yeah, were they open about it? I mean, when I was first getting in touch with these people, a lot of them said, well, you know, I'm retired now and I feel able to talk about it for the first time, whereas when I was in my career, I wouldn't have really wanted anyone to know about it because it might have had adverse effects. So there were maybe a few people who said, oh, you know, I've never made a secret of it, but I think the majority would have not bruited it about for those reasons.
Thank you. And now another question about gender. And there's this another tantalizing clip of your table of contents about the schools for girls. And I know you mentioned it a bit, but Birgit is saying that she was surprised to learn that there were Napoles for girls. Did they have to endure tough selection tests? How were they prepared for any leadership roles, seeing that Nazi ideology imposed such appalling limits on the role of women? So if you could speak more about the girls' schools, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I found this really fascinating when I started to research it, and I was fortunate in that there was a PhD thesis / book by Stephanie Flintrop on the moods in Napoles, and I was able to correspond with her and kind of have a look at her archive as well, because it was harder to get in touch with former pupils from the girls' schools because, you know, surnames change when they get married, as many of them did. But yeah, so when it came to the founding of these schools for girls, a lot of the high up bureaucrats or Nazi leaders like Martin Bormann, people in the finance ministry, they absolutely hated the idea of elite education for girls. And the inspector of the Napoles at this point, called August Heismeyer, who was an SS officer, but also married to the Reich women's leader, Gertrude Scholz-Klink, which I think is interesting and perhaps quite important. He was sort of fighting back and going, no, actually, it's really important that we do have training for female leaders as well. And that's why you might have noticed that most of the girls' schools, apart from one, are either in Austria or the Netherlands or Luxembourg. They're not in the Reich itself, and that's because he wasn't able to persuade them to give him the money to found them in Germany. There was such a lot of pushback. In terms of the selection, I mean, there was still definitely an emphasis on physical training, and you might say, well, that's also because they were supposed to be able to be good mothers and kind of healthy to bear children and stuff. But they had this kind of analogous curriculum where, you know, when they did missions, they would not go down the mine, obviously, they would go to like a spinning mill or a textile factory, and where the boys were having very explicitly pre-military training, they would have talks from Wehrmacht high-ups. They would have talks from doctors on, you know, care of infants, or, you know, lessons on how to look after livestock and cookery and stuff. But broadly, they still seem to have been quite academic, or as academic as the boys' schools. And the kind of habitus of leadership that alumni displayed, and that they displayed even in kind of later life, seems to have been broadly quite similar. So in a way, there was less difference than you might expect, apart from kind of more gendered activities, I guess.
That's interesting. Thank you. We have a few more, and I think we'll have time to just get them all in. The pupils' education broke off abruptly in 1945, as we understand. Did your interviewees speak about that aspect and how their education continued post 1945? Yeah,
so actually one of the things that I've written about, well, both in the book, but also in an article from 2015 in German History, where I kind of looked at the narratives that they told about how the system unraveled in 1945, but how they then would claim that their education had really stood them in good stead, both for surviving that chaotic kind of Stunde Null time, but also then being able to cope well when they returned into education. And you know, whether truly or not, it's kind of hard to say, I guess, although I have found archival evidence that suggests that they were often quite well able to integrate into their new classrooms in 1945, 46, and were doing, you know, quite well academically, at least in the cases that I have evidence for. They would say, well, you know, we were just better able to cope with these kind of things. And they have these narratives about how their Napola training has really stood them in good stead, not just in education and higher education, but kind of in their later life, in their careers and so forth. And I find that interesting because it points to this idea that there is almost a specific Napola collective memory with some elements that you don't necessarily find in ordinary kind of other German narratives from this period.
That's interesting, and actually it goes to there's a penultimate question about the pupils' impressions of the schools, and I don't know if you want to add anything else about that. So, I mean, obviously you just started to talk about that. You know, did it change at all in retrospect? Are they, you know, as you refer to this kind of collective memory, do they speak about it together in a way? I mean, have they formed a kind of, you know, are they in touch with each other, and is it, you know, is it sort of a formed, you know, community in a sense? Yeah.
So yeah, those are two really interesting questions. When it comes to the pupils' impressions, what was really interesting was that there was an incredibly wide spectrum, from some who would say, well, you know, I know it was, you know, a terrible regime, but it was still some of the happiest days of my life. And then you've got ones who are like, you know, I never want to even talk or think about it again. It was absolutely horrendous. We were being trained into potential killers and murderers and this kind of thing. And then you have everything in between as well. And I think, again, perhaps if I'd been doing this research, you know, 10 years earlier, when some of the older generation who'd gone on to serve in the armed forces would have been talking, they might have been a bit more unreconstructed potentially in some of their attitudes. But I think it was easier for the younger pupils who were still, you know, 12 to 15, 16, to kind of just transition into that post-war thing and kind of lay aside and just go, well, we were just seduced by this ideology, we were, you know, abused by it, you know, that kind of narrative. And again, in terms of whether they're still in touch with each other, there are these groups. I actually went to a couple of reunions from Köslin and Spandau during my research, just sort of anthropological interest almost. And what was interesting there was that now it's kind of a get together, their wives come along, they'll go on, you know, trip to the Potsdam Film Museum or something like that. And the wives said to me, you know, it's really interesting because they never normally talk about their school days when they meet up at these kind of Treffen, but actually because you're here, they kind of feel that they have a license to sort of bring these photos and actually start talking about it. But yeah, but again, there are other people who just say, well, I don't want anything to do with that kind of comradeship. But where people are, there is this kind of sense of community, I think, also as the numbers have shrunk, that they will all automatically call each other by the familiar du rather than sie. Things like that, that imply that there is this code that's kind of stuck with them, that they all feel like they went through a similar experience, and that brings them together in some indefinable way.
Interesting. Okay, then there's one question, which is probably related to the paperback version of the book. Is there any prospect of a German edition of your book?
Yeah, so I have had at least one publisher kind of wrote to me about it, and I think there definitely will be. I just want to see, because what I really want is, I don't want to have something that's, you know, a massively cut kind of Bowdlerized edition, because I really want German scholars to engage with it on its own terms, including like the vast amount of research that went into it. So what I want to do is take the time to find a publisher who would be willing to basically just publish a straight translation, which I think is possible. The question is, would it be kind of a more serious trade publisher, or would it be someone like Wallstein, who's slightly more academic? But you know, I don't want to make that decision lightly, but I am working on it. So
that's great. That's great. Well, and we've had also some other nice comments in the chat from people who are tuning in from Australia, which is great. It's good. It's another good reason to have it a little bit earlier in the day than our usual program. So it just leave it to me to, you know, the last thing to say is to thank you for taking the time to speak to us and for coming back to the library with your project. It's really nice to hear that it's come kind of full circle, and it's a fantastic sounding book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. And thank you again for taking the time to speak to our audiences. And thank you to everybody for participating and for your excellent questions. Oh, and also from Canada, which is nice to see too.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been wonderful. It's been a great pleasure.
And hopefully next time in person. Next week in person. Yes. Right. Good luck with everything. Thank you again. And thanks to all for tuning in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.